Hey guys, I'm Hannah Cox with Base Politics, and welcome to a very special episode. If you have not seen it yet, you have to head over and watch a recent debate that I participated in on the Jubilee Media YouTube channel. And if you're coming here from that video, welcome to my channel. I am so excited to discuss my experience. This was actually my second appearance on a Jubilee production. Back in December, I also participated in a debate called Capitalist versus Communist, and I had an awesome experience. I love a debate, more so because I love talking to people across the aisle. I love actually finding middle ground with people, which is the entire premise of this debate series. And so I was super pumped to appear for my second time and give it another go. This time we were talking about gun control. If you're new to me and don't know much about my background, I actually got my start in politics working for a Second Amendment group in Tennessee. This was one of those gun groups that you will find exist all over the country, mostly to oppose the NRA because they are such trash. After that stint, I went on to work in public policy for a number of years. I worked on tons of issues, but I did a lot on criminal justice reform and mental health. I spent some time volunteering with the National Alliance on Mental Illness. That led me into a lot of work on the death penalty, and then that opened up a lot more work on criminal justice reform because there is so much overlap between those two fields. I actually helped overturn the death penalty in 3 states and pass numerous other pieces of criminal justice reform across both state and federal levels. And I've also successfully worked on a number of other public policy issues as well. So coming into this debate, I was really excited because I felt like there would be a ton of overlap between my views and those on the left, since I actually do approach gun rights and gun control from a pretty informed viewpoint when it comes to issues that many on the left care about, including suicide and criminal justice. And several things I would say did go better this time around. First and foremost, we had a moderator. If you watched the Capitalist versus Communist debate, it was chaos. There was no moderator. There was one particular participant that the internet hated because he just talked over people the entire time. He would cut people off. He was very, very frustrating to try to have a conversation with. So I was really happy to see that we had a little bit more order this time around. Secondarily, I'll say that I genuinely really liked everybody that they casted for this debate. Behind the scenes, while I always try to get along with everybody, some of the participants in the Capitalist versus Communist debate were just insufferable. I didn't have that experience this time around. I thought everybody there was like a really good person, very well-intentioned, had good faith arguments, so that went splendidly. It was a much less stressful environment because of that. But all that being said, I am making this video today because I'm pretty peeved at Jubilee. I felt like the first go around, I had a very fair shake with them. I thought that they did a good job of creating an environment where you could actually have a real debate, a real discussion, and they didn't try to put their thumb on the scale. I've had a lot of people in my camp tell me that they would not go do this kind of production because they are so afraid that they would get a bad edit. And I get that fear because the vast majority of the media, including new media, is controlled by people who are more left-wing and have an agenda. I have zero problem debating people on the left because I feel very, very solid in the reasons why I believe what I believe. But I think even for people like me, that fear is always there that they're going to misinterpret what you say or give you a bad edit or do other things that would make you look unfavorable that are outside of your control. And that's where I really feel like this time around, Jubilee did not act in good faith. While I think all of the participants there and I had really great conversations and actually did find a lot of middle ground behind the scenes, which I'll touch on, Jubilee, I think, left a lot of things on the editing floor that showcased that kind of camaraderie. They really did a poor job in picking many of the elements that they chose to include in the edit. I wouldn't say they gave anybody a bad edit per se, because they don't do that shifty thing where they're cut and splice editing, but their choices on what was included and what wasn't were interesting. But more importantly than that was their attempt at fact-checking the episode, you guys. I have so much to say about this. First and foremost, if you are hosting a debate, it's not really your job as a moderator to put your thumb on the scale. And if you're going to, then it needs to be in the context of the actual conversation so that both sides have a chance to respond. I think one of the big problems with the left right now is that there seems to be this mentality that there are facts and absolute truth, and then there's misinformation. But in reality, half the time the left is pushing information, it is false information and can be easily debunked. And at the end of the day, the only way we can adequately decide what is factual, what is truth, is through open debate so that people can counter information, poke holes in information, so that they can offer alternative views. But what Jubilee did instead was try to come in after production closed and weigh in from afar. And not only did they try to weigh in from afar, but they did a piss poor job at it. Like, honestly, my jaw was on the floor at some of the fact checks they dropped in there because they are so easily debunked. This is something I often say we have to do. You have to fact check the fact checkers because fact checkers often have bias and an agenda. And because they refuse to acknowledge that, they often get a lot wrong. In this case, I really don't know who was responsible in doing this for Jubilee, but they themselves were no datatician because many of the things they tried to source are studies that have been laughed out of existence for years. Other things they flashed on the screen had absolutely nothing to do with the topic at hand, and they were just trying to make it seem like they were countering it. But if you actually listen to the conversation that we were having, and then you read their fact check, you're like, wait, that doesn't actually even pertain to what's being discussed, much less does it refute it. But unfortunately, a lot of people are highly susceptible to this kind of subtle manipulation. I saw so many people in the comments being like, wow, those people definitely got fact checked. Look at all those fact checks. Were they themselves actually even reading the fact checks or checking to see if the fact checks were true or held up? No, they just want to stay in their echo chambers. And when they're being presented with arguments that effectively counter what they believe, they are so happy to have a little pop-up come on the screen and say, don't worry, you don't have to think about this. This is wrong. Even if what's on the screen doesn't prove what's being said is wrong. When it comes to the gun control debate, there is bias across almost every single study we could possibly discuss. And this is one thing that I thought was frustrating. Aside from the editing and the really bad fact checking on this episode, were the very heavy subjects they failed to get to with a moderator present. Before each episode, they asked participants what are the key things you want to talk about. And one of the things I told them is that I wanted to talk about the methodologies that are used to create gun data because there is so much bias, and that leads to people believing very disparate things on both the left and right. When it comes to studies, when it comes to research, you have to pay attention to a lot of factors. Importantly, you need to know who is funding it and do they have an agenda or an outcome that they're trying to get from that research. Most of the time, the answer is yes. That really can't be avoided because why would people pay for research for the most part unless they were trying to get a tool they could use to get their agenda further down the line? But a more ethical way of approaching these things is to acknowledge that kind of inherent bias, to recognize it, to call it out, to expose it, and then to present other data that might refute it. So if they were going to fact check this episode, one thing they would have needed to do to actually act ethically and in good faith would be to show both sides of the argument. One thing I noticed is that not once did they flash any of the numerous pieces of research that I mentioned and sourced throughout the interview. That would be pretty easy to do. And even if you disagreed with my data, you could still at least source it and then offer an alternate viewpoint. Again, I think that should have been done in the context of the debate. But the problem Jubilee had, I suspect, is that, frankly, nobody else there could actually push back on me. And this is not shade on any of the participants. Like I said, I thought they were all lovely. But one thing that became very apparent quite quickly is that I am an actual practitioner in this work. I'm somebody who has not only passed a lot of public policy around these issues, I really understand data. I know how to read it. I was well researched, and I was able to recall a lot of information off the top of my head. So much so that at the end of the debate, both sides acknowledged that. Everybody else on my team was like, oh my God, I'm so glad you're on our side. And then even people on the left were like, listen, we agree with you a lot. We actually appreciated what you had to say. Several of them got my numbers to try to work with me afterwards. All of that, interestingly, got left out, despite the fact that Jubilee claims they're making these episodes to try to find middle ground. And so I think because they didn't have anybody there who could meaningfully really debate me, they tried to do it after the fact. And the problem here is they can't meaningfully debate me either. So we are going to fact check their fact checks, and I'm going to work you through the episode. I just want to say a little humble brag. I was literally able to write this outline, source it, link it, provide counters within an hour. Okay? It was not hard to do. So that's why I think I'm kind of annoyed, because if it was your job to fact check for Jubilee, you should have been able to do a much better job than this. Okay, so let's begin with the first clip and fact check that I want to fact check.
So to me, I throw that all out the window and just say, what is that number? What does that look like to you?
I think for me, the number would have to be that you could prove that there are more lives being lost to gun violence than saved.
Oh, that's easy. That's already happening right now.
It's no way. All right, so last year,
Yeah.
about 18,000 people were killed with a gun.
Yeah.
They estimate 162,000 people saved their own lives in interactions where they
Wait, you said how many people died with a gun last year?
Around 18,000.
But there's 29,000 just in suicides and guns last year. You're completely wrong.
I said gun homicides. 18,000
yeah.
or so gun homicides.
And
we're going to separate this out.
Why?
Because suicides are a whole different matter and require different solutions. But we're going to talk about
No,
homicides where you have no control in the situation.
Yeah, sorry.
Around 18,000 people were murdered last year with guns.
Yeah.
162,000 are the rough estimates for how many people saved their lives last year with a gun.
And so when define save your lives.
They were in interactions where the statistics show they would have definitely or certainly lost their lives had they not had a gun to protect themselves. So they were in high-stakes situations where had they not had a gun to protect themselves, it is almost certain they would have been murdered.
I have a question. Did they have to like shoot the gun in order to save themselves?
Yeah, that's statistic, because I've studied that statistic in depth. And what
you didn't seem to know it.
No,
they don't always have to have shot the gun. It is whether or not they had a gun. Sometimes they had to shoot it, sometimes they did not. But still, the statistics about how many people are saving their lives every year dwarf the number of gun violence homicides.
There's a problem with the statistic, I'll make it quick, which is there's no way to say for certain you would have died if you didn't have a gun. Let's say I go in to rob someone with a gun and then they had a gun and I left. That is not a statistic to say you would have died if you didn't have a gun.
Right.
And that's what that study actually shows.
That's not what it showed. It shows they were in interactions where somebody had a gun to their head, they were in a high-stakes situation, and had they not had a gun to defend themselves,
would have for sure pulled the trigger.
They most certainly would have.
How would you know that?
The likelihood is very high that they would have.
How would you know that?
And again, what number is fine for you to say you don't have the right to defend yourself in that situation?
I would say
because I would say I would much rather err on the side of being able to defend yourself, and that's a lowball statistic. It's really around 500,000 to over 1 million they estimate maybe have interactions where they save their lives, but they can't measure that because it's harder to measure things that don't happen.
Okay, so the context of what we are discussing in this segment is how many lives are saved by a gun each year versus how many lives are taken by a gun each year. And as I said in the segment, you have to remove suicides, which is the vast majority of gun deaths every year in the country, from homicides to effectively have these discussions. Because while suicides are a problem and something that I definitely wanted to address more than I got to in this episode, they require different policy solutions because a person is making a choice to take their own life. That is very different than somebody who is being murdered outside of their control by somebody with a gun. And so the question Dominic had posed to me was like, at what point would you be okay taking away people's guns? And my answer was that you would have to basically show me that more lives would be saved. And that is in no way possible because the numbers of people who use guns to save their lives every year dwarfs the number of people who are murdered by guns each year. This is not even up for debate, okay? It's a kind of a hard thing to measure because you're trying to track things that did not happen and that could have, okay? Already, when we look at crime statistics, they are a hot mess. There really is no good way to comprehensively track a lot of criminality, and that's because we don't have like a uniform method of tracking it. Police departments turn in data sort of like willy-nilly. There's not even like a requirement that they have to fully turn in their data. And secondarily, their data is not very good because the vast majority of crimes don't go reported to police because they don't solve crimes, so most people don't even bother. But all that being said, with the very shaky data we do have, it is indisputable that more people save their lives in self-defense with a gun every year than there are people who are murdered by a gun each year. And that data is really easy to find. I find it interesting they made no effort to flash that on the screen, especially considering Dominic and I were in a pretty significant debate over that particular data, over that study. So why would you not look that study up or even just ask me for it so that you could put it in the show notes? Now, when I went into this debate, because I was acting in good faith and because I'm not really like this hard left or hard right person, I tried my best to use very conservative numbers because like I said, I recognize that if you get a piece of information from like a gun rights group like the NRA, or if you get a piece of information from an anti-gun group like Everytown, they're going to be significantly biased. And so the best thing you can try to do is try to find research that is at the very least being conducted by third parties who are actual researchers who are using peer-reviewed scientific methods, and then try to look at what we have and try to make a fair argument for one side or the other. Now, I, unlike Jubilee, will link every source that I am going to discuss in this episode in my show notes, but I'll read to you from this one that I was referring to in the actual debate. This is reporting by Forbes on the research, and they wrote, "Many gun rights advocates are wary of such research, fearing it will be used to fuel a partisan political agenda." They're talking about government-funded research. Dr. Timothy Wheeler of Doctors for Responsible Gun Ownership has noted that the CDC has a track record of anti-gun bias. In the 1990s, one CDC official even stated that his goal was to create a public perception of gun ownership as something dirty, deadly, and banned. But regardless of whether gun violence research is being conducted by the federal government, states, universities, or private organizations, there are three key principles all public health researchers and firearm policy analysts should remember. The numbers of defensive gun uses each year is controversial, but one study ordered by the CDC and conducted by the National Academies Institute of Medicine and National Research Council reported that defensive use of guns by crime victims is a common occurrence. Now, I want to pause right there. My sources for this are the CDC and the National Academies Institute of Medicine and National Research Council, okay? These are not pro-gun groups. These are groups that are staffed by government bureaucrats who are overwhelmingly left-leaning and who I detest. And even their data backs me up. They go on to say almost all national survey estimates indicate that defensive gun uses by victims are at least as common as offensive uses by criminals, with estimates of annual uses ranging from about 500,000 to more than 3 million, in the context of about 300,000 violent crimes involving firearms in 2008. Another study estimates there are 1,029,615 defensive gun uses per year for self-protection or for the protection of property at home, work, or elsewhere, excluding military service, police work, or work as a security guard. That would yield an estimate of 162,000 cases per year where someone almost certainly would have been killed if they had not used a gun for protection. I quoted this study verbatim in that debate. This is a very good study. I wouldn't say it's unbiased because, again, it was run by left-wing entities, government entities, the very body that has an agenda to take away your gun rights, the government, those guys, this is their research. Now, I obviously could have gone with the higher numbers and estimates that are provided in that study and in others, but I was conservative because I was acting in good faith. Furthermore, I pointed to statistics that have been replicated year in, year out, over and over and over at a national level. Now, let's look at the fact check Jubilee flash on the screen during this exchange. It says, researchers at the University of California, San Francisco determined individuals with access to a firearm are 3 times more likely to die by suicide and almost twice as likely to be killed in a homicide compared to those who do not have access. I'm sorry, what the F does that have to do with anything that Dominic and I were talking about? It doesn't. This isn't even relevant. Furthermore, you're going to throw up a stat from the University of California, San Francisco? You don't think there might be a little bias within the researchers who did that study? You don't think that study was also probably funded by the government? This is why I'm annoyed, because if they wanted to have a good faith debate and actually debate me on the merits, that's all well and good. What they did was notice that I ran circles around the whole thing and then tried to come in and tip the scale after the fact because it didn't go the way they wanted to. And the moderator actually even acknowledged that towards the end of the debate where he was like, this has been a very unusual debate. There were a lot of responses we weren't anticipating. He was shook that none of us supported the NRA, which is just so funny because these people don't even try to understand the people that they think they're up against, right? It's total strawman. You don't know any gun rights supporters if you think that the vast majority of them support the NRA. High key funny. But anyways, back to this little fact check of theirs. I'm glad they finally wanted to talk about suicide because I didn't get to at the actual event despite trying to multiple times. So let's discuss their stat. Yes, if you have access to a gun, you are more likely to die by suicide. Not because the gun magically makes you suicidal, but because if you have an intention to commit suicide and you go and purchase a gun, you are more likely to complete that suicide because it is more effective. Furthermore, the people who go and buy a gun to use in their suicides tend to be the ones that are most committed to carrying it out. So yeah, this stat has absolutely nothing to do with the number of people whose lives are saved each year by a gun versus those who are taken by a gun each year, which is the subject at hand. But furthermore, it also disingenuously tries to give the appearance, I guess, that because we have more guns in America, there are more suicides, which is actually not accurate. Let's look at Japan for a really good case study. Japan has some of the strictest gun laws on the books. You can't even get like a handgun there. And yet they consistently are in the top 1 or 2 spot globally for suicides. This is from the Japan Times, and they say Japan's suicide rate is the 6th highest in the world. This is as of right now, and the 2nd worst among 8 major industrialized nations, according to the latest government white paper on suicide measures released. This year's report, approved by the cabinet, shows that the number of people who took their own life declined to 21,897 in 2016, the lowest level in 22 years, but the figures also show that suicide was the top cause of death among people in 5 age groups from 15 to 39, a trend that stands out amid a decline in other generations. Japan's suicide rate, the number of suicides per 100,000 people, stood at 19.5 as of 2014. Russia topped the list of 8 major economies at 21.8. Japan's rate was higher than France, the US, Germany, Canada, Britain, and in Italy. So having a lot of guns in the US does not mean that we have a worse suicide problem, which I guess is what they were trying to insinuate with this fact check. The same is true for like the homicide component of the stat. It's kind of meaningless and completely off topic from what was being discussed, which was again, how many people use guns to save their lives every year. But also it's just like obvious. Yes, bad people use guns to do bad things. Nobody's arguing that. So if a criminal has access to a gun, then they are more likely to be involved in homicides. I'm going to flash this chart on the screen just to show the gun-related deaths in the United States for 2022, which is really the last year we have reliable data. We're still gathering things for 2023. And as you can see there, suicides are the biggest problem when it comes to gun deaths. They account for 56% of deaths related to firearms. And then 41% is in second place, and those are homicides, which is the number I was trying to actually focus on. And as you can see from this graph, the total number of firearm-related deaths in all of 2022 was 48,204, and only 41% of those were gun homicides. So if you compare that to the number I was giving Dominic of 160,000-ish people who use guns to save their lives every year, I was correct. Guns save far more lives than they take year after year after year. All right, let's move on to the next segment I want to discuss. This one's not a fact check, but I just didn't get to respond to this, and I want to.
I am expecting a girl, and I don't think that I'm going to build her feminism off of whether or not she can have a gun. I want her to be able to protect herself, stand up for herself, and be comfortable in who she is without a gun.
So if she's very strong and very well trained, and she's a confident young lady, and she's a feminist, and she has a 300-pound man with a gun pointed at her, what do you think is...
Why does this man have a gun?
Well, yeah.
Okay, so this remark was made by Sarah, I believe her name was, and again, she was lovely. She actually came up to me afterwards and told me she agreed with a lot of what I had to say. But I just wanted to call this out because I'm very passionate about this, and I thought that Jessica, I think her name was Jessica, did a very good job responding to her. You can teach your daughter to feel powerful, to feel confident, but at the end of the day, self-defense is not about your feelings. It is about your ability to actually stand up for yourself and defend yourself. And when you look at the numbers of women who continue to be sexually assaulted and raped or even murdered, particularly in instances of domestic abuse every year, I stand by the fact it is criminal to not teach your daughters how to actually defend themselves. And this was another thing we didn't get to talk about. I had asked the production to include this because it's very personal and I wanted a chance to discuss it. But I have had an experience of a friend from college, who was murdered by her husband with his gun. And he was a cop in Alabama. And he had tried to kill her numerous times before he was successful. And she was anti-gun. She was kind of left-wing. I remember talking to her and I was like, please get a gun. Please learn to defend yourself. She had a restraining order. She had left the marriage. She had moved out. She was doing everything that we tell victims to do. But he was violating it. He was still stalking her. He was still showing up. He didn't care. And the police were not meaningfully intervening to save her, as they often, I would say, actually even usually don't, because they themselves are domestic abusers. Like, the stats on that are insane. And the only thing that was going to stop him was her ability to actually defend herself and get a gun. She didn't do it. And he murdered her shortly thereafter. So I hope, Sarah, that you come around to my version of feminism for your daughter's safety. Okay, let's move on to their next fact check.
I want to kind of get some clarity because I still feel like I'm hearing like a contradictory thing. Who is in favor of there being more guns in Black communities? And why is that?
So according to the Department of Justice and also the Pew Research Center, as the number of guns have increased in this country, as the gun rate ownership has increased, so has the homicide rate has decreased. And it's decreased not just for homicides, but also for suicides. So statistically, we actually know that as there are more guns, you actually have less violence.
Suicides just reached the highest peak this year.
Nope, not the highest peak. The
Yes, it
highest
is.
peak since about 1980 as well, but not the highest peak.
But we have the highest level of guns we have today, and we have the highest level of suicides today.
No.
Or one of the highest levels. It's,
Right.
it's gone up.
So people have a mental health issue because they want to kill themselves and they just happen to have a
No,
gun.
but she's saying that it
We'll
goes
dig
They
down.
just
into
don't have
mental
news
health.
or medicines.
We'll
lying
dig
around.
into mental health in a minute.
So again, this was very good faith data that I actually stated in the interview. I'm really kind of just impressed and amazed with my ability to recall these things in an interview because it's high stakes, you're nervous, it's a lot of things to try to remember. You have like no ability to look at your phone or anything to remind yourself. And yet I perfectly recall that the study I am referencing was done by the U.S. Department of Justice and Pew Research. So that's so weird, Jubilee, that you couldn't just go find that. And again, at least point to it and counter it with something else if you want to, but you can't actually counter it because the data is the data. You just don't like the data. And again, it is data that I'm using from entities that are not pro-gun. The U.S. Department of Justice, Pew Research. Like at this point, I wish I had acted in a little bit more bad faith since they were going to do this. I could have actually like really trounced them with some like very heavily skewed right-wing data. I didn't do that. So like I said, this is reporting by Forbes on these studies and their headline says, disarming realities as gun sales soar, gun crimes plummet. A couple of new studies reveal the gun control hypester's worst nightmare. More people are buying firearms while firearm-related homicides and suicides are steadily diminishing. What crackpots came up with these conclusions? One set of stats was compiled by the U.S. Department of Justice. The other was reported by the Pew Research Center. According to the DOJ's Bureau of Justice Statistics, U.S. gun-related homicides dropped 39% over the course of 18 years, from 18,253 during 1993 to 11,101 in 2011. During the same period, non-fatal firearm crimes decreased even more, a whopping 69%. The majority of those declines in both categories occurred during the first 10 years of that time. Firearm homicides declined from 1993 to 1999, rose through 2006, and then declined again through 2011. Non-fatal firearm violence declined from 1993 through 2004, then fluctuated in the mid to late 2000s. And where did the bad people who did the shootings get most of their guns? Were they the gun show loopholes? Nope. According to surveys the DOJ conducted of state prison inmates during 2004, the most recent year of data available, only 2% who owned a gun at the time of their offense bought it at either a gun show or flea market. About 10% said they purchased their gun from a retail shop or pawn shop. 37% got it from family or friends, and another 40% got it illegally. Shocker. While firearm violence accounted for about 70% of all homicides between 1993 and 2011, guns were used in less than 10% of all non-fatal violent crimes. Between 70% and 80% of those firearm homicides involved a handgun, and 90% of non-fatal firearm victimizations were committed with a handgun. The March Pew study, drawn from numbers obtained from the Bureau of Justice Statistics and again, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Like, guys, I hate the CDC, and yet even their data confirms my worldview. They also found a dramatic drop in gun crime over the past 2 decades. Their accounting shows a 49% decline in the homicide rate and a 75% decline of non-fatal violent crime victimization. Those gun crime rates certainly aren't diminishing for lack of supply, at least not for law-abiding legal buyers, who are, by the way, amongst the safest and least likely demographics to commit crime in the entire world. Last December, the FBI reported a record number of 2.78 million background checks for purchases that month, surpassing a 2.01 million mark set the month before by about 39%. The December 2012 figure, in turn, was up 49% from a previous record on that month the year before. FBI checks for all of 2012 totaled 19.6 million, an annual record, and an increase of 19% over 2011. Now, I recognize that pretty quickly people are going to say, like, oh, that data is 10 years old. Yes, the data is 10 years old. We don't have access to a lot of more recent data because, interestingly enough, when the DOJ and CDC had to reveal these findings, they did not go their way. And so they have not been, it seems, super ready to do more research into these same kinds of situations. So this is the most recent data that we have available, but it is very concrete and very damning for the gun control people's narrative. I will point out that quite obviously there were fluctuations and spikes in crime during COVID, though I will also say much of that got overblown by the media and was used to curtail good criminal justice reform that was getting done. But the COVID fluctuations point to my overall viewpoint on criminality, which I think I did a pretty good job of inserting into this debate, which is that criminality has a lot more to do with poverty, with lack of education, with youth, with your brain not being fully developed than it does with guns. And what happened during COVID is you shut down schools, so kids didn't have anywhere to be. They didn't have after-school programs. They had a lot more time on their hands. That means a lot of them ended up getting in a lot more trouble and even falling into gangs in many areas. And you also saw a lot of people being pushed into poverty, which is intrinsically attached to criminality. Anyways, back to their fact check that they do put on screen, again, not putting the actual data being discussed anywhere to be found. They instead come in with this irrelevant tidbit. They say, states with high rates of firearm ownership consistently have higher firearm homicide rates, according to Johns Hopkins University. Okay. Number one, there's a lot of data to push back on this. This is one study from Johns Hopkins, which is a very anti-gun institute. But secondarily, this doesn't debunk the data from the CDC and the Department of Justice. It's actually irrelevant. And I truly don't know if they are too stupid to recognize that their fact checks are irrelevant and don't debunk the topic at hand, or if they're just desperate to try to throw something up on screen because what's being said is not good for them. But either way, let's dig into their dumb fact. So here are the states that sold the most guns in 2023. And then here are the states with the highest firearm homicide rates. And as you'll notice, they're not one and the same whatsoever. So again, their factoid isn't even concrete. It's irrelevant. And it also just shows such an inability to interpret data. And I honestly think we need to teach data interpretation in schools, because this is a problem with a lot of Americans. They just see a number and they don't know how to actually read it, right? They don't actually know how to interpret data and read into it. But even if this fact were true, that would have a lot more to do with a correlation of poverty in those states, because the poorest states in the country, typically southern red states, often have very high rates of gun ownership, but they also have a lot of poverty. And so you do see a lot more issues with crime, not because people own guns, but because they are impoverished. Next, as Dominic and I want to just say I appreciated Dominic so much. He was the only other person there that really felt like he was super informed on the subject matter at hand, or had some experience actually working on these issues. And he and I ended up agreeing on a good bit behind the scenes. But as you can see in this exchange, we are debating the rate of suicides. Okay. And this is an important distinguishment that just went right over the heads of Jubilee. And also, I don't think Dominic understood the difference I was making in this exchange, but that's more because we kept getting cut off and interrupted around us. But I am discussing the rate. Dominic is throwing out overall numbers. There is a huge difference in that. When we are looking at criminality, you study the rate. You don't study the overall number, because populations grow. You get more people. Just because you have a larger number of suicides or homicides one year does not actually mean that crime is worse, or that you are at a higher chance of experiencing crime or suicide. It just means there are more people in the population, so the numbers go up. The rate is what you look at when you are actually looking at data. And it's so sad. You can even hear me just almost defeatedly trying to say at the very end, I'm talking about the rate. And I just get cut off. Notice the moderator cuts me off. He's like, we're going to talk about mental health later. We're going to talk about this later. And yet I never got a chance to talk about it later. Their fact check, again, throws up the overall suicide numbers, which is not really relevant and not what I was trying to discuss at all. So let's compare where we're actually at with the suicide rate in recent years. I'll again remind you that in the context of this discussion, I am referencing the studies from 2014, which are the latest and best that we have, talking about how both homicides and suicides decreased as gun rate ownership increased. So those numbers were not up to date with the current suicide rate right now. I would acknowledge that. As I said, a lot of things spiked during COVID, and that has everything to do with Democrat policies that shut down cities, shut down schools, forced people into isolation, and we've seen tons of secondary fallout from that. Suicide increasing being one of them. I do not deny that. But I am trying to talk about the suicide rate in relation to the numbers of guns in a population. So I am working off a piece of data. And again, Jubilee it doesn't seem to compute with them. So they flash this number up there. So yes, if you want to totally move the conversation, the number of suicides in 2022 and 2023 was pretty high due to COVID policies, but that didn't really there is no data comparing that with rates of gun ownership at the same time. So it's just irrelevant to go there. And furthermore, while there were a ton of suicides, numbers-wise, in 2022 and 2023, they were not the highest rate of suicide that we've seen in the country. I'm going to flash this up. I'm not going to read all of this, but here's a comparison of the suicide rate over the past 100 years, separated by decades. And as you can see, quite obviously, the rate was the worst during the Great Depression, where you had a 22.1 out of 100,000 people. In 2022, you had 14.9 per 100,000 people. So that's pretty high historically, and that's worth acknowledging. I just wish we'd actually been given the space to fully flesh this conversation out, because I'm sure we could have gotten there between Dominic and I, and instead the moderator shut us down. And then they're going to throw up an irrelevant factoid after they wouldn't let me complete the thought. Total Bush League Jubilee. That's what I have to say to you. Okay, I also just have to take a minute for I'm sorry, for me this is comic relief. I didn't even know how to respond when this girl said this. Roll the clip.
I actually really hate that argument, we should have the teachers and administration should have guns. More guns is not going to help anything, because at the end of the day, let's just say you shoot the school shooter, right? Then that's still a dead person, right? And their life isn't worth anything more or less to me than my friend's life, because a life is a life.
Homegirl, that is quite a take. I don't have anything else to say. I just want to make sure everybody caught that too.
I was a teacher for 5 years, a public school teacher, and I was a teacher when they were trying to arm teachers. There are so many issues that teachers deal with on a day-to-day basis. Having a loaded gun in my classroom with 19 special education preschoolers is not on the top of my list. That would not make me feel more comfortable. That would not make me feel like my students are more comfortable.
Well, definitely
but
not
statistically,
that.
It would make you more safe.
No, it wouldn't.
I mean, can we talk about gun-free zones, or is there a prompt on this, or can I go? Because we looked at the data around this, and over 90% of mass shootings occur in gun-free zones.
Okay, on to the absolute worst thing Jubilee did in this entire episode. And it's so bad, I've been laughing about it all day, because I'm just the audacity to do this is next level. And I don't know, maybe it's not next level audacity, maybe it's next level stupidity, but the fact that they did this is just Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Ridiculous. So I try to talk about gun-free zones, which interestingly enough, they really avoided. They did not want to go there, probably because the data is very damning for gun control on these actual stats. I quote that about 90% of mass shootings occur in gun-free zones. That is, again, a conservative estimate. I would say people further to the right, gun groups, they would actually put it at 97 to 98% in most of their studies. You've got some more fair analysis from left-wing groups that would put it somewhere in the 80s%. But the fact that they flash the Everytown study, I cannot. This study has been laughed out of existence. First and foremost, Everytown is not a scientific research organization. They are a bunch of anti-gun crusaders. They picket at state capitals. They are constantly appealing to people's emotions. They're just activist left-wing people, okay? So using any piece of data from them is the equivalent of taking an NRA study and flashing it on the screen for my side. Both of which I would laugh out of existence. That is so ridiculous. But aside from just who conducted the study, I have to get into their methodology, because again, I didn't get to talk about how disingenuous a lot of the methodologies are when it comes to gun issues on the debate, but this is a perfect example. So riddle me this, when I say a gun-free zone, what does that conjure for you? Okay, I want you to go ahead and get it in your head without me in any way influencing you, because I think most people would have a very common definition of what they think a gun-free zone is, right? Everytown did a study that did not match that common sense definition. And this is how they get the outlandish claim that only 10% of mass shootings happen in gun-free zones. The study is so infamous, it's just wild. So I was talking to ChatGPT about it. I was trying to be fair. I think ChatGPT leans a little left too, but I like it. They said the study you're referring to, conducted by Everytown for gun safety, has indeed been a topic of debate and criticism, particularly from gun right advocates. Let's break down the key points and criticisms. They say the study claimed that only a small percentage, around 10% of mass shootings, occurred in gun-free zones, but their methodology was this. Everytown's definition of a gun-free zone was narrower, yeah, you could say that, than what many people might expect. They excluded locations where armed security or police could potentially be present, even if the general public was prohibited from carrying firearms. This meant that places like schools, government buildings, and certain businesses were not counted as gun-free zones in their analysis. Obviously, critics have argued that the study's definition was very restrictive and does not align with a common understanding of gun-free zones. By excluding certain locations like schools where the general public cannot carry firearms, the study might have underrepresented the number of mass shootings that actually occurred in places where civilians are prohibited from being armed. Like, the brazenness of this study actually takes my breath away. It's the most bad faith study I can think of in existence on literally any issue. First and foremost, and like of the utmost importance, is that police have no duty to intervene to save you. Absolutely none. I'm going to touch on that more in a minute, okay? But absolutely none. So if you have a school, or you have a government building, or you have a concert where the general public is banned from carrying their guns, and where law-abiding gun owners like me, therefore, do not bring their guns, you don't count that as a gun-free zone because a cop might be walking around the premise and might have a gun on them? Like, that is a gun-free zone, okay? The Crime Research Prevention Center, which I think has very good data, I like their methodologies, they are often accused of being pro-gun, but like, they're really not. It's run by a scientist named John Lott. They do everything by the book. Their data just ends up favoring a pro-gun narrative because that's what the data says, okay? And according to their findings, 97.8% of mass shootings over a 68-year period occurred in gun-free zones. Like, you don't even really need research to back this up, okay? If you look at where mass shootings occur, I cannot name a single one that did not occur in a gun-free zone. They make people sitting ducks by stripping them of their ability to defend themselves, particularly, again, law-abiding citizens who are much more likely to intervene to save themselves and you than police officers are. And then when they get gunned down by psychopaths because they know those people are sitting ducks, they try to gaslight you and say, that's not the problem, that's not why this happened. That is exactly why these things happen. You used to have guns in schools. You used to have gun trainings in schools. And guess what you didn't see at schools? School shootings. I'm sorry, you have to be a literal asshat to not think that there is a significant correlation and causation effect happening with gun-free zones and mass shootings. Now, I want to go on to this next clip because they actually reference Uvalde at one point, and I didn't get to respond to this, but like, yeah, say more. You're making my point.
So like Uvalde, right? The 376 cops, they did a great job of stopping that shooter, correct?
And it took them 7 minutes, by the way.
Well, cops are not, that's another thing.
But they were trained people with guns, and there was 376. How did that work?
So Uvalde was atrocious, and it was atrocious because it is perfectly indicative of what happens with gun control policies. You had a school, you had vulnerable people, you had unarmed, teachers and administrators who could have better defended themselves. You even had parents who were trying to get in there and defend their kids. Meanwhile, you had police. So according to Everytown, this isn't a gun-free zone, right? You had police who were in there for like 40 minutes, failing to intervene, letting more people be killed, even though they could perfectly have gone in there with their own guns and taken care of the situation, but they didn't. And they didn't because police have no duty to intervene. The Supreme Court has ruled this over and over and over, and therefore they have no incentive or motivation to put their lives in danger in any real meaningful way to protect you. Therefore, the argument that only police should have guns and you're safe in that kind of environment is asinine. Like, Uvalde is a perfect argument for why gun control is so stupid. All right, let's move on.
Less than 2% of homicides are mass shootings in this country. So I appreciate that we're talking about this, but I feel like it often gets very overblown when we're discussing gun violence and its approaches because it is a bit of an anomaly. And I know that often
Do you think it's unique to the United States?
No, I was going to go there next, actually. Out of the, I think, 97 developed countries they've studied that have had mass shootings, we're 64th on the list. We're also number 64 when it comes to homicides per 100,000 people.
Well, I mean, I think just this last year, we had more mass shootings in America than calendar days.
Okay, so once again, because they didn't want to actually like set a foundation here and establish what kind of methodologies we're using to attribute to certain terms, mass shootings is another one of these like really squishy, like loosely defined categories when it comes to data. When you and I think of a mass shooting, we are mostly thinking of a situation where a lone individual, maybe two, are coming in with an agenda to kill as many people as possible. Most of those people are strangers to them and they are shooting at random. That would be a mass shooting. But the actual like standard that most studies use to measure this is far from that. They basically just say anytime there are 4 or more people killed with a gun, that's a mass shooting. So that would include gang deaths and gang shootings, which I think are quite different than a mass shooting and also require very different solutions. It would include like a dad coming in and killing his wife and kids. Like there's all kinds of things that would fall under that very squishy definition that I don't think most of us would think of when we talk about mass shootings. But just to be clear, that is the actual data that we have to examine. But even with that very loose and I think questionable measurement, the thing they flash on screen is again just ridiculous. They say the U.S. accounted for 73% of mass shootings that occurred in developed countries between 1998 to 2019, according to a 22 study by a professor. So this is just one guy did a study. This is his findings, but there's a lot to counter these findings. And it's just so interesting, again, that you pick and choose which ones you are putting on screen and failing to actually source the ones that I'm actually talking about in the moment. So if you want to like actually debate me from afar, from a third party position who was not actually in the debate, at the very least, that's how you should be conducting yourselves, Jubilee. But let's look at the hard data around these numbers. So this is reporting by the Chicago Tribune, and they say by our count, the U.S. makes up 1.49% of the murders worldwide, 2.20% of the attacks, and less than 1.15% of the mass public shooters. All of these are much less than America's 4.6% share of the world population. So I was right yet again, and this one random paper they flashed on screen was not. This is another study. This one's done by John Lott, who I referenced earlier, and this is just the abstract. This is a very long study. If you want to read it yet again, I will actually put my sources in the show notes. But he says, the U.S. is well below the world average in terms of the number of mass public shootings, and the global increase over time has been much bigger than for the United States. Over the 18 years from 1998 to 2015, our list contains 2,354 attacks and at least 4,880 shooters outside the U.S. and 53 attacks and 57 shooters within our country. By our count, the U.S. makes up less than 1.15% of the mass public shooters, 1.49% of their murders, and 2.20% of their attacks. All these are much less than the U.S.'s 4.6% share of the world's population. Attacks in the U.S. are not only less frequent than other countries, but they are less deadly on average. Out of the 97 countries where we have identified mass public shootings occurring, the U.S. ranks 64th in the per capita frequency of those attacks and 65th in the murder rate. Not only have these attacks been much more common outside the U.S.'s share of these attacks have declined over time. There has been a much bigger increase over time in the number and severity of mass shootings in the rest of the world compared to the U.S. Jubilee, it's not hard to find this information. Like, I am embarrassed for you. Furthermore, if you look at this study of intentional homicides per 100,000 people, this is just like concrete data. The U.S. is number 64. So this whole push to act like the U.S. is so much more violent because we own so many guns, it falls apart so easily. Furthermore, the Chicago Tribune also reported while Americans are rightfully concerned by the increased frequency and severity of mass public shootings, the rest of the world is experiencing much larger increases in per capita attacks. The frequency of foreign mass public shootings since 1998 has grown 291% faster than in the U.S. All right, and then let's go on to their last stupid fact check.
I mean, I think just this last year we had more mass shootings in America than calendar days.
No.
So I mean, it was more mass shootings in America
you can't just look
just
at
this
numbers.
last year.
You have
than
more
calendar
people
days.
in America than in most countries. We have a homicide rate of about like 1.5%, I think. We have a mass shooting rate of a little under 1.15%. We are 4.6% of the world's population. So when you look at those statistics, no, it's not that we are more likely to have it here. I think we are a larger country by far. And I think the other thing that makes us lean more into violence in general is that we are living in a very diverse population. When you look at countries that have lower rates of violence, they're more homogenous. It's difficult for people to get along. They often have not been given the techniques. You have many cultures that are often clashing. I think a lot of our violence issues actually traces back to that.
Rambo.
They say the homicide rate rose from 5.8 per 100,000 people in 2018 to 7.8 in 2021, then fell to 7.5 in 2022, according to the CDC. Okay, again, kind of irrelevant. These are just spikes and fluctuations that happened around COVID. And again, mostly traced directly back to really bad policy decisions Democrats mostly made during that time period. Where some Republicans too, let's be fair, some Republicans too, but it was mostly led by Democrats. So yeah, the homicide rate spiked during COVID. It was mostly thanks to dumb Democrat policies. And as you can see here, I'll just flash this on screen. we're still in a much better situation when it comes to homicide rates than we were just, mere decades ago. In 2022, the homicide rate was 6.3 per 100,000 people. That's still significantly less than the 10.2 per 100,000 people we saw in the 80s and even the 9.8 per 100,000 people we saw in the 90s. Like, Jubilee, get your shit together. All right, so by my count, not only was I very easily able to debunk everything they put on screen or point out how irrelevant it was, I also want to point out all the things they did not fact check, okay? Not only did they fail to put up many of the things I was saying that were easy to source, were easy to prove, they also failed to fact check the other side, the vast majority of the time. The vast majority of the time. And that's why you can tell that they were biased in this and they had an agenda, because the other side was saying some crazy shit. Let's roll this clip for one example.
Oh, first off, most states don't even have that. 44 states don't even make you register.
I never saw a state.
Okay, so for the record, the federal government has required background checks in every 50 states since 1993 under the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act of 1993. So that's not true, what Dominic said. What he, I think, is referring to, but didn't actually clarify, is the loophole situation where once you have purchased a gun, if you sell it to a friend or you sell it to somebody like a gun show, that doesn't get background checked at that point. Now, that's still something that does happen in a lot of states. A lot of states have passed that requirement on their own, but this is a frequent target of the left to go after. I'm fine with that. I don't have an issue with background checks. I also don't think they do much, and the data backs me up on that, but that's another argument for another time. But have the background check. I don't care. What I do have a problem with is him arguing that we should have registration lists. I'm against that for anything in government. The government should not have registries on its people, okay? Historically, that has led to very, very bad things. We have a right to privacy. We have a right to the Second Amendment. It is not their business who owns the guns. Okay, but now let's get into the most significant thing I think they failed to fact check, this exchange between me, Dominic, and Justice, where we are talking about the, likelihood, the real chance you might have in using a gun against a tyrannical government. And I am consistently saying, obviously that's not something that you want to see happen. But yes, unarmed people, they are the ones that end up in communist dictatorships. And then they have to find a way to go swim with sharks to escape them or try to get the guns they need to stand up for themselves. And both Dominic and Justice tried to push back on me for this and say they tried to name regions and examples in history where, according to them, peaceful nonviolence was all that was needed to overthrow a tyrannical government. Now, I was trying my best to listen to them. I think I try my best to have intellectual humility. And to be fair, I am not an expert in geopolitics. I'm an expert on U.S. politics. I am, but I'm not an expert on South African politics or Indian politics or Egyptian politics, which are the places they were trying to discuss. So I was, hearing them out, listening to them. But, even my limited knowledge, I was like, something doesn't sound right here. Let's roll the first clip.
I think it's a rarity that you could see people rise up and effectively do this because of how big the government is, because of its techniques and tools. It would require actively training and organizing for some time. But if not that, then what is the solution for when things really hit the fan? What is the answer for people?
I think it's just fear mongering. It's a slippery slope of we're going to be North Korea if we don't
have
guns.
You can end up there. So what do those people do?
So I think there's a drastic difference between America and North Korea. If you're creating, again, a whole different scenario, there is context. It would be a completely different answer.
But I'm just asking, in any country, if not,
Gandhi,
if
right?
not Second Amendment.
Gandhi, for example, he picked up AR-15s and guns and he shot, right? That's how he freed India.
How did he free India?
Not through violence, through non-violence. So what you said, it's basically a lot of it is just organizing.
Organizing, yeah.
But what I'm saying is,
who did he overthrow?
I'm saying getting freedom.
Just answer the question.
No, I'm just saying getting.
We all need to know, who did he overthrow?
I'm saying the government. I'm saying people who are in power over them.
What government system did he overthrow?
Even if it's England, even if it's anyone.
He didn't. But he had a great movement. He didn't overthrow a government.
But did he change anything?
He definitely changes people's opinions. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, how do you overthrow a tyrannical government without a Second Amendment?
But there's this distinction between overthrow and change. In Egypt, you could call it overthrow, you can call it change. They got the president out.
They had a military coup.
In Egypt?
Yes.
Or in Tunisia?
A military
with
guns.
I want to piggyback on.
Hannah,
I'm gonna let you ask. I just want to say, in South Africa, they overthrew the government through non-violent means.
Okay, so they actually tried to back Dominic up in this exchange, even though he is dead ass wrong in his assertion. They put up this image talking about who Gandhi was and like his theory of nonviolence, which is, I mean, great. I love Gandhi's theory of nonviolence. It also influenced Martin Luther King Jr.'s theory of nonviolence, which I referenced in this debate, which I'm a fan of. I give a whole speech around the country about the 6 principles of nonviolence and peaceful civil disobedience. But the reality is that you have to have people with guns to back that up. And that was certainly true with Gandhi. The fact that they did not actually put up the actual information that he and I are debating. Because again, I can't weigh in. I don't know that much about Gandhi. I'm actually trying to feel my way out, but I'm just like, I'm pretty sure there were people with guns involved in this whole thing, right? And he's like, yeah, I don't know. And then he tries to move to Egypt, which they also did not fact check. And even then I'm like, wasn't that a military coup? They didn't fact check any of this. Instead, they try to make it look like he was right with their like inserts, but he was wrong. Sorry, Dominic, love you, but you were really wrong on this. So here's a quick list of the groups who were armed that fought alongside Gandhi to free the Indian people. You had the Indian National Army, you had the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association, you had the Ghadar Party, you had the revolutionary cells and groups. I mean, it goes on and on, okay? I couldn't even like fully screenshot all the list of people who were armed participating alongside Gandhi in this. And then additionally, I will point out that I was right about what happened in Egypt. It was a military coup, which very much involved guns. But they didn't stop there. They also then tried to move and say that Nelson Mandela freed South Africa from apartheid with no guns. Let's roll that.
I'm gonna let you ask. I just want to say, in South Africa, they overthrew the government through nonviolent means.
And again, we get no fact check from Jubilee on this. Isn't that crazy? So here it is from me. Nelson Mandela was also surrounded by people who were armed in this fight. And not only was he surrounded by people who were armed, it appears he actually was involved in like organizing them. This says, while Mandela himself became an international symbol of peaceful resistance, he was also involved in the establishment and leadership of an armed wing of the African National Congress. And then you can read, I'll flash these on screen, more about some of those groups. This is actually like wild to me. As I say in the debate, like I don't know of a single instance throughout history where an oppressed people has actually been able to rise up and get their freedom without guns. There were also numerous other things that I thought it was like frankly irresponsible of them not to fact check. Like the amount that we like talked about mental health, which was not really in depth and not, I don't think, sufficient really.
Not everyone with a mental health issue goes and shoots people, but everyone who would go and shoot people en masse clearly has a mental health issue.
What I would say is don't stigmatize mental illness in this process, because so much of this conversation does end up stigmatizing people with mental illness, does make them less likely to seek help and resources for fear of stigmatization. And so mental health might be a component of addressing gun violence, but we can't like hang our hat on it.
It was done irresponsibly because they allowed a lot of things to be said, and even the moderator, I thought, phrased things in such a way that left the perception that people with mental illness are more likely to be violent, which is frankly disgusting. You had a responsibility to actually fact check that, Jubilee, on just for ethical grounds. We already struggle with people with mental illness being less likely to seek help because of the stigmatization. They are afraid that they will be seen as violent. They're afraid that they will lose their rights. This is especially true for people in like military divisions or working in police. Like this was a disgusting thing to not fact check on your part. The reality is that people with a mental illness are far more likely to be a victim of a crime than they are to be a perpetrator, and you should have made sure that that was clear.
I mean, it was so many times they posted the face of Kyle Rittenhouse. There were so many times they posted the face of the individual who shot the people in that Buffalo.
But you think that make other people do it? You think that make...
Secondarily, in the episode, somebody in the like pro gun control camp basically tried to say that Kyle Rittenhouse was like a white supremacist vigilante that went and killed people. Kyle Rittenhouse acted in self-defense and was found innocent in his trial. That's also an irresponsible thing to not at the very least fact check. I could probably do like 10 more of these things they failed to fact check, but I want my producer to still like me, so I'm gonna wrap there. As a whole, I want to say doing research is a lot more than seeking out confirmation bias. Data is often misused, and if you don't know how to read data, you're probably going to act irresponsibly and unethically with it, as Jubilee did. It's very, very easy for people to go and try to find information that like coddles them and proves their worldview. It's a lot harder for people to seek out information from people that they dislike, they disagree with, that challenges their worldview. It's harder for people to go and actually have conversations with people across the aisle and try to find common ground. I'm very proud of all of us who sat down there to do that. It's just such a shame that Jubilee was not like holding itself to the same standards. I really expected them to foster a productive actual debate and conversation, and I don't think that happened. And it's a shame because, like I said, there actually was a lot of middle ground found after this. Several of us exchanged numbers. We're planning on working on some policies together. We agreed on a lot more than we disagreed with, and yet they suspiciously left a lot of that footage out of this episode. Instead, they came in and tried to throw the debate by putting a bunch of crap in the edit in the after effect. So what I'll say is, Jubilee, I probably won't be back unless you want to put your dumb fact checker on stage with me and let me have a go at them next time. All right, guys, that's a wrap. Leave me a comment. Let me know your thoughts. And don't forget to check out other shows coming out this week. We've got the Base Politics podcast every Friday and my show Histrionics on women's issues every Sunday.